Mark Anders stepped onto Zyphora 7 with confidence. Well, forced confidence. He adjusted his diplomatic badge, took a deep breath, and muttered to himself. Just smile, shake hands, and don't die. The hall was intimidatingly oversized for the hulking Zifferin warriors around him. They were built like tanks, each one radiating the kind of energy that said they could tear a man in half for fun. And judging by the skulls decorating the pillars, they probably had. A deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. Human! You're late. Mark turned. Commander Vetra. 7 feet of pure, battle-hardened muscle wrapped in tight combat gear that barely contained her imposing curves. Scars ran across her arms like battle trophies, her dark violet skin glistening under the war torches. She had the resting face of someone who'd killed at least 3 people before breakfast. Mark cleared his throat, offering his most diplomatic smile. Ambassador Mark Anders, at your service. Looking forward to. Her hand shot out. Oh, right. The greeting. He instinctively grasped it, a firm, professional handshake, just like he'd been taught in all those diplomatic training sessions. Big mistake. The moment their hands met, a bone-crunching force surged through his fingers. His knuckles popped like bubble wrap, his feet lifted off the ground, and a sharp pain shot through his wrist. Vetra's grip tightened. Mark's vision blurred. Stay conscious, stay conscious, stay conscious. Vetra narrowed her piercing yellow eyes, studying him like a science experiment that refused to explode properly. You're still conscious. Mark forced a grin, barely suppressing a scream. I have a high pain tolerance, he choked out, eyes watering. She smirked. Impressive. Most beings faint by now. His hand felt like it had been through a garbage compactor, but this was a diplomatic mission, damn it. He was here to make peace, not whimper like a fragile-boned human. Yeah, Mark wheezed. I'm tougher than I look. Vetra finally let go. His arm immediately went limp. He resisted the urge to cradle his mangled fingers like a newborn. You are not what I expected, she mused, tilting her head. I assumed humans were fragile. Oh, totally, Mark said quickly. Extremely breakable. Squishy even. I cry when I stub my toe. Vetra chuckled. Then why did you not cry just now? Mark shrugged with his good shoulder. I don't know, maybe I'm into it? Her brows raised. Mark immediately regretted his words. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Vetra's eyes gleamed with interest. Fascinating. Somewhere in his diplomatic training, no one had warned him that accidentally flirting with a 7-foot alien warrior woman could lead to an international incident. The High Council members exchanged intrigued glances. Vetra studied him again, this time, with more curiosity than contempt. Perhaps you are stronger than you appear, human, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Mark swallowed. His hand was still throbbing. He was 95% sure his pinky was pointing in the wrong direction. Yet somehow, he might have just made a good first impression. Mark's hand was still throbbing by the time he found himself seated at an oversized Zifferin dining table, staring down at a plate of meat so large it looked like it was meant to feed an army. The room buzzed with the sounds of clanking weapons, deep laughter, and the occasional brawl breaking out in the background, which, apparently, was normal for a Zifferin dinner setting. Vetra sat across from him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, while warriors tore into their meals like feral beasts. Mark cleared his throat, doing his best to ignore the fact that he couldn't feel his fingers. So, I appreciate the hospitality. Vetra didn't respond immediately. She simply reached out, grabbed a hunk of meat the size of Mark's torso, and tore into it with her teeth like she was personally avenging her ancestors. The bone snapped with a sickening crunch. Mark blinked. She swallowed, eyes locking onto him like a predator that had found an amusingly fragile plaything. Eat, she commanded. You'll need strength for later. Mark hesitated. That sounded ominous. Still, diplomatic duty demanded participation. He picked up a chunk of what he assumed was meat, took a bite, and immediately questioned all his life choices. It was like chewing on solid iron, coated in something that tasted vaguely like battery acid. His teeth ached on impact. Vetra watched expectantly. He forced a smile, swallowing the bite like it was a grenade. Delicious, he wheezed. Her brow lifted. You endure well. I'm very motivated to survive, Mark said, gripping his half-paralyzed hand under the table. A large goblet slammed down beside him. A Zifferin warrior grinned. Drink, the warrior bellowed. You must try the warrior's blend. Mark eyed the black, bubbling liquid, which hissed as it touched the cup. That wasn't normal. He glanced at Vetra. She simply lifted her own goblet, downed it in one go, and exhaled sharply, like someone who had just inhaled jet fuel and enjoyed it. Mark sighed. God save me. He grabbed the goblet, took a deep breath, and gulped. The moment the liquid hit his tongue, his soul briefly left his body. His throat burned, his stomach twisted, and his lungs threatened to go on strike. This wasn't alcohol. This was rocket fuel mixed with the tears of the damned. His vision blurred, his legs went numb, and for a brief moment, he was pretty sure he tasted the color purple. Vetra smirked. You live? She asked, watching him with amusement. Mark's entire body felt like it had been set on fire. He forced a thumbs up. Stronger than it looks, he choked out. She actually laughed, a low, throaty sound that was far too attractive for someone who had just poisoned him. The table erupted into cheers and heavy slaps on the back, one of which nearly dislocated his shoulder. Good, Vetra said approvingly. Now we fight. Mark froze mid-sip. What? Vetra stood, rolling her shoulders like a warrior readying for battle. Zifferin dating traditions. Right. His stomach dropped. I don't suppose this is the kind of fight that involves, say, a friendly game of chess? Vetra cracked her knuckles. Do I look like I play chess? Mark swallowed. Then he ran. It didn't matter. She caught him in 2 steps, hoisted him over her shoulder like a sack of potatoes, and with zero hesitation, slammed him through the nearest table. Wood shattered. Plates clattered. Mark saw his life flash before his eyes. He landed on his back, groaning, as Vetra stood over him, arms crossed, looking unimpressed. A beat of silence. Then she offered him her hand. Mark, blinking through the pain, reached up to take it. The moment his fingers wrapped around hers, she yanked him upright, only to flip him over her shoulder and slam him right back onto the ground. His lungs evacuated. Vetra tilted her head. You are oddly durable, Mark wheezed, staring at the ceiling. You are a very affectionate woman. Vetra smirked. That was a compliment, yes? Mark coughed up something that might have been part of his soul. Sure, he rasped. Let's go with that. The Zifferin warriors cheered. Vetra offered her hand again. Mark, ever the diplomat, stared at it like it was a death sentence. Then, with zero self-preservation instincts, he grabbed it anyway. Mark woke up to the familiar feeling of searing pain and mild regret. His body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder, but at least this time he wasn't dead. Small victories. He blinked up at a dimly lit Zifferin med bay, the scent of sterilized metal, and something vaguely ominous filling the air. His ribs were wrapped in thick bandages, his arm was strapped to his chest, and judging by the dull ache in his jaw, he had lost a tooth somewhere along the way. Vetra sat beside him, arms crossed, watching him with that same unreadable expression. He groaned. Please tell me I at least won something. You survived, she said. That is more than most can say. He sighed. Not exactly the kind of victory he had in mind. She studied him for a long moment. Then, after what felt like internal deliberation, she finally spoke again. I was, perhaps, too aggressive. Mark let out a breathless chuckle. You think? Vetra frowned. I do not wish to break you. There was something almost hesitant in her voice, a shift from the usual deadly confidence she carried herself with. Mark smirked, despite the stabbing pain in his ribs. You'd be surprised how flexible humans are. Her eyes darkened with something unreadable. Mark realized a second too late that his phrasing had, yet again, been deeply unfortunate. Before he could backtrack, Vetra leaned in. His heartbeat jumped. Zifferins weren't exactly known for their emotional openness, but she was looking at him with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite amusement. He swallowed. You intrigue me, she said, voice softer than before. That was either a very good thing or a very bad thing. Mark barely had time to process it before she reached out, resting a calloused hand on his cheek. He froze. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, considering she had nearly turned him into a human pancake just hours ago. Her thumb brushed against his jawline, tracing the bruises left behind by their rather intense first date. You do not fear me, she murmured. Mark hesitated before giving her a lopsided grin. Oh, I'm absolutely terrified, he admitted. I just have a terrible sense of self-preservation. Her lips quirked slightly. A silent beat passed between them. Then she moved. It wasn't like a soft, hesitant first kiss. Zifferins didn't do anything halfway. It was sharp, full of unrestrained energy, a mix of dominance and raw emotion. And also, a lot of teeth. Mark had exactly 1 second to think. Oh wow, this is happening, before she bit his lip. Not a playful nibble. Not a teasing graze. A full-on, predatory bite. Pain shot through him. He yelped, a very unmanly, embarrassing sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Vetra pulled back, brows furrowing. Did I do it incorrectly? Mark, hand flying to his bleeding lip, stared at her in horrified realization. Wait. Was that supposed to happen? She nodded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. Zifferin mating rituals involve a show of strength. Mark blinked very hard. That was a kiss? Vetra tilted her head. Is that not how humans do it? Mark stared at her, then down at his now very bloody fingers, then back at her. Not exactly, no. She frowned. Strange. He exhaled sharply. You don't say. A beat. Then, as if realizing something, she sighed. I may have miscalculated your fragility again. Mark let out a wheezing laugh, wiping blood from his mouth. You know what? Let's call it a cultural exchange. Vetra smirked. Mark really should have known better than to find that attractive. Mark didn't know what was worse, the fact that he had nearly died 3 times in less than 24 hours, or the fact that he was actually starting to enjoy it. Vetra had a way of making pain feel almost exhilarating. After their disastrous first kiss, which he was still trying to convince himself had been a misunderstanding, Mark found himself being escorted through the palace halls by Vetra. He was still sore from the fight, still processing the fact that his lip was now permanently swollen, and his bruised ribs made him feel like he had been run over by a herd of elephants. But none of that mattered anymore. They'd won the peace negotiations somehow. Against all odds, and after much near death, they had reached a compromise. The Zifferins had agreed to ally with Earth, and humanity had been granted access to some of their advanced tech. A monumental victory. But Vetra's treatment of him had thrown all his diplomatic skills out the window. The thought of being sent back to Earth now, after all of this, felt wrong. He didn't want to leave. Mark was just about to voice his thoughts when the door to Vetra's quarters opened. He barely had time to register it before she shoved him inside. His stomach twisted. Vetra, I. Sit, she ordered. There was no room for argument. He sat. Vetra followed, shutting the door behind her with a heavy thud. She turned to face him, her usual fierce demeanor now softened, her expression more contemplative than it had ever been before. I have been thinking, she said, her tone quieter than usual. About what you said. Mark blinked. What I said? Her eyes narrowed. You said you enjoy this weird connection we share. Despite the injuries. Mark's face flushed a little, but he quickly regained his composure. I did, yes. And I meant it. She cocked her head. Why? He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because it's real. You don't hold back, Vetra. You don't pretend to be something you're not. You're fierce and honest, and Mark broke off, surprised at the intensity of his own feelings. Because you like pain? She asked bluntly. He chuckled, rubbing his sore neck. Not exactly. But I can't deny, there's something about you that pulls me in. Even if it means I'm going to need a full body cast when this is over. Vetra's gaze softened, just a fraction. I do not know how to be gentle. Mark met her eyes and smiled. That's the beauty of it. You don't need to be. I'm not fragile. I can take it. And maybe I like it a little rough. There it was again. His mouth getting ahead of his brain. But to his surprise, Vetra didn't pull back. Instead, she stepped forward close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her. I am not like other women, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Mark swallowed. No kidding. I've never been lifted off the ground so many times in one day. Vetra's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. You are not frightened of me, then? She asked, her voice low. Not anymore, Mark said, his voice steadier than he felt. For a moment, they just stood there, either of them moving. There was no hostile tension between them anymore, only something else. Something undeniably real. Vetra took a breath, her expression turning serious. I do not know how to make you understand, but I have never met anyone like you. Mark tilted his head. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me, even if it sounds like a warning. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his, and this time, Mark didn't pull away. There was no crushing grip this time, no sudden pain. Just the gentle press of her fingers against his, as if testing the waters. For a moment, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. Mark grinned, wincing slightly at his bruises but unwilling to stop. Guess I'm stuck with you now, huh? Vetra's lips quirked. Maybe. But this time, you will not be the only one in pain. Mark raised an eyebrow. You do realize we're probably going to get into a fistfight in the morning, right? She shrugged. It would not be the first time. He chuckled, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. Despite everything, despite the brutal handshakes, the broken bones, and the near-death experiences, he hadn't felt more alive in his entire life. Maybe, he said, but I think I'm starting to like this way of doing things. Vetra's eyes softened, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered. Then let's see if you can handle me without breaking this time. Mark grinned through the pain. I've never been more ready for anything. The night stretched on, and in that moment, everything felt right. The dangers, the chaos, the pain, it was all worth it. Because sometimes, the wildest love stories were the ones that almost killed you. And with Vetra? He had the feeling it wasn't going to get any less dangerous.